tell you, be careful tonight because you can see that Dr. Jehle has a pretty big influence on people's lives. About 15 years ago, I went on a Christian history tour up in New England. And from that, I ended up coming back here and teaching people about the principal approach. And it's great for me to see some of you here tonight from that time back then. And also from that, I ended up teaching for the last 6 years at Dr. Jehle's school. There's only one thing that could get me to come away from there, and that was to come back home to the South, because this is my home. But anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed teaching there and teaching for Dr. Jehle. He is the senior pastor at the New Testament Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Probably heard of Plymouth before. That's where the Pilgrims came in. I learned a lot about the Pilgrims while I was up there, and also the Puritans. But anyway, not only is he the senior pastor there, he's also the headmaster of the New Testament school. He is a noted American historian. He conducts Christian history tours all over New England, and if you haven't been to something like that, you really do. It is life-changing. Okay? He also conducts tours in Virginia and in Washington, D.C., and he is a person who speaks on many different subjects. He is a noted constitutional law authority. He teaches constitutional law, universal history, foreign policy. My daughter was a student at his school for 2 years while she was, I guess, her junior and senior year. And I wanted to know more about those classes, so I took them too. What was really frustrating to me, though, was that I studied and I took the test and I took my first test and he gave it back to me and I didn't have a grade on it. And I said, oh no. I said, I studied, I have to have a grade. So then I started getting grades, and what made me the happiest of anything was see a little smiley face up on top of my paper. That meant I did a good job. Anyway, but he can speak on a lot of different subjects. But right now, he's very much in demand as a constitutional law authority, something that many people either don't even know anything about or have forgotten about, that we even have one in America today. He has conducted over 350 seminars and conferences worldwide and started over 150 schools and churches and helped develop them in America and internationally. Now, you must think, this man doesn't sleep. I don't think he does sleep too much, as a matter of fact. He also has a family. He has a wife, children, and grandchildren. And somehow he fits all of those things into one life. So we are blessed, and it's an honor to have him with us here tonight. He is going to help us to step back into history, to go back to the Boston Harbor and to that famous Tea Party in 1773, 236 years ago. So without further ado, I will just introduce to you Dr. Paul Jehle.
Well, I've been asked to come and share some things with you as Dr. Joseph Warren, because I hear today that people are talking about tea parties. At least I've heard that some people are talking about tea parties, and some people have even gone to them. But what people say about those tea parties and what people say about what we did back in 1773 is not quite accurate. And so I'd like to take a few minutes and take you and tell you a story of what my life was like up until that day and 2 years following. I was born June 11, 1741. My father, when I turned 14 years of age, died in a terrible accident where he was climbing an orchard tree in our backyard. He fell out of that tree as an accident and died. I was not alone losing a father at an early teenage age. A lot of my friends lost their parents at a fairly early age. We learned how to become the assistant to head our families, especially our mothers, where we worked the farm, we worked all the chores, and we made sure that when we went into town, we had the right profit for all of what our produce had produced for our family. We understood what hard work was all about. In fact, I can remember when I was 14, at that momentous year, when my father passed away in that tragic accident, we began to talk as young people. At 14, and recognizing what I had just gone through, other 13, 14, 15-year-olds, we began to talk. And one thing that I kind of think is a little different back when we were young than today is I find that 13, 14, 15-year-olds, when we would get together, we talked about the momentous events that were taking place in our country. It was 1755. That year may not mean much to you, but 1755, why, we were all talking about a young man who had given a stirring defense of his thesis at Harvard. I had just entered Harvard at 14, and many others of my age were also considering the same. I would end up graduating when I was 18 years of age from Harvard University, and with a law degree and understanding the basics of law and what we were taught. But when I was just entering Harvard, we heard about a young man who was a bit older than most graduates, at 23 years of age. But he had defended his thesis in front of the governor and the royal authorities. And it was the talk of the town. The title of his thesis was this: "Whether it be lawful to resist the supreme magistrate and even the King of England, should no other appeal have worked, and it proved to be the last resort for protecting the liberties of this colony." That's a long title for a thesis, but not overly long for the ones that we had to defend. But we were talking about this because we heard that the governor had said when the thesis was over that this 23-year-old, he had turned to one of the other royal judges and said, "I perceive that we better watch this young lad. He could be trouble." Well, his name was Sam Adams. He was trouble from the British point of view. And in 1755, we were all thinking of these things. Now, why were we thinking of this? Because we all had been taught from the pulpit when we would go to church, the church going to meet. Now, that was something in colonial America. We would meet at 9 a.m. in the morning, and we would have an hour of psalm singing. And there would be a collection for the poor, and a collection also to help the minister in his duties in visiting the sick and discipling and shepherding the flock. And then we would hear a 2-hour sermon. Yes, 2-hour sermon. It would usually end around noon, and since it was the Sabbath, we had all prepared lunches ahead of time. And so when we came, we had all come, and we would eat usually on the green and the lawn just outside the church, because it wasn't over. By about 1 or 1:30, we would be back in the church. The afternoon service was a bit different than the morning one, for in the afternoon, many of the heads of households, the fathers, would have to stand up, and they were called upon by the minister. And he would then look over for farmers and merchants and cloth makers and individuals or barrel makers who would save grain, and they knew how to seal up the barrels, whatever their vocation was. The minister would call and would say, "Why, Master so-and-so, could you stand and give an account?" And Master so-and-so would be the head of his family, and he would stand up and he would articulate the main points of the morning message. And then he would say how he and his family were going to apply it that week. Well, I think that's such a good custom, it would be good for churches to follow that today. What do you think? Yes. Well, you see, we knew what was preached, and it became serious. We wondered why there were such messages from church to church and town to town. The messages emphasized, among other things, 3 key ideas that we learned and we embraced. And when we embraced them, they became part of our very soul. Yes, at 14 and 15, they were being reinforced at Harvard. And we were taught very clearly that from the very beginning, from our charters and rights as Englishmen, that our rights came from God. They did not come from the crown. There was more and more talk of the crown prerogative. The crown prerogative meant whatever the crown, or basically the king, thinks is a right, he simply makes it up, and then he enforces it upon the colonies. Well, we heard in the Sunday messages over and over again that God in his word had said that rights come from his hand, for there must be a power greater than civil government to give a right that civil government can protect. For what kind of protection is it for a government that gives the right to promise to protect it? In fact, we heard it over and over again. This was an idea very clear to us. The only rights you could claim were the rights that were given directly from the hand of God. But I remember another idea that we were strongly taught, reinforced by the lectures at the University of Harvard, there in Cambridge. That was clearly this, that all government instituted by God operates by covenant. Covenant. That the officers that are elected to their duty in civil government have a covenant with God. They also have a covenant with the people. And it is simply this, that covenant is to promise to obey the written constitution that binds their every action. All government operates by covenant. And we were trained and taught to discern when we voted for someone whether or not that person was going to follow the covenant or not. In fact, election day in the colonies was a big affair. It was a holiday. No one worked on election day. It was the day when we met at 9 in the morning. The pastor of the town, or if there was 2 churches in the town, which was quite unusual, but if there was, the clergy would lead the parade. Yes, there was a parade. It would start usually down either by the waterfront or down where the town green may be, and it was a short affair. But behind the clergy were all the candidates for public office. And they would march in a parade, and family after family, it was a fun day. We packed a lunch. This was a picnic. This was a day where we were going to talk about where we're going to vote as a family. Oh, only the head of the family would vote for the family, but we all discussed how he was going to vote and why. And the families fell into line, and we went to the church. When we got to the church, the first row was assigned for all the candidates for office at every position. They sat in that front row, and one of the ministers was chosen to give the oration, the sermon. It was called an election sermon. And he would get up and he would preach. It was strange because as a young person, I scarcely don't remember him looking at anyone in the audience but the candidates. It was as if he was preaching to their very soul, telling them what they owed to God, telling them that the oath they took before God simply meant this, that I promise to obey this written charter called the Constitution in every way. I take an oath to do it, so help me God. And the oath simply means if I in any way fail to do it, I ask God to judge me and bring a curse upon my life for lying and committing perjury in public. And thus, the candidates listened very carefully because government operated by covenant. A third idea that was hinted at by the defense of this thesis by Sam Adams was this. There was a lawful way to appeal injustice. There was talk that soon there would be a new king in England, and we would have to know how to resist injustice. Is there a way to resist injustice? In fact, we would hear this at Harvard. Is there no other way? For only 200 years before, there had been a terrible, terrible, not only Inquisition in Spain, but hundreds and thousands of Huguenots in France had been slaughtered because they would not disobey God. We would ask this question over and over again. Is that it? For the believer in Jesus Christ, is that it? If we disagree, if a government reigns beyond its bounds, if a government or its officials refuse to operate by the covenant they took an oath to follow, is there no recourse but martyrdom? Is there nothing we can do except simply stand our ground and die? And our professors at Harvard taught us that yes, there is. It was taught to us as the lower magistrate principle, that we could only resist duly constituted authority if we were under authority. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft before God. But if we were to resist an unjust government, we would have to resist in submission to whatever former written appeals were already there. We could not invent our own. But any appeal that was lawful, we had to use. And we always had to do it in submission to someone in authority. And it was hinted there may come a day when all the rulers that are in authority are corrupt. And if they are corrupt, then the thing we must do is elect our own rulers and submit to the proper law, for we could never resist authority directly. These were ingrained in us. So you must see that when 1760 came and King George III was crowned in England, he vowed that he would take every dormant law that had been put on the books for 100 years, since the year 1660, and would now make the colony bow its knee. The laws to be enforced, these were laws that were made up by the crown, the prerogative. Yes, we were bound under monopoly with the mercantile system with England. We bought most of our goods there as a colony of hers. But we all had just one king, King George. We respected him. Long live the king, we would say. But we all had our own parliaments. We all had our own assemblies. It was written in our own charters. Every charter of every colony made that very clear. So we would recognize we elected our own representatives, and we would govern ourselves and pass any tax that we wished. And if the king really felt that he needed money, which the king did in the 1750s, he wanted us to pay for the French and Indian War, to which the British supposedly helped us to fight. But the British were always in our way. They helped our opposition more than they helped us. Why, they would send generals over here in the wilderness. We would have a young 24-year-old George Washington who could walk like an Indian, run like an Indian, and not be heard like one. But we had a general come here who wanted a space of 10 feet cut in the wilderness so he could ride in his chariot with cushions with the beat of the drum to make sure the opposition knew he was arriving. We told him this was no way to fight a war. He didn't listen, and we nearly were massacred. And then they want us to pay for that in an unjust way. We said, if it's legitimate, we will pay, but we will discuss it in our own assemblies. And we did discuss it, and we only paid what we thought was right, but it wasn't what he wanted. And when the new king came to the throne, he said he was going to bring back the royal prerogative. Everyone knew what that meant. It didn't take long. The year was 1761. And on February 5, everyone came to that small hall in the old State House in Boston. Why? This was a big event. James Otis, the man with the biggest mouth in Boston, who could speak for 4 hours and no one move, who could quote 25 sources without looking at a note or a piece of paper. A man so brilliant. We came just to listen for 3 hours. It was sport. And he was going to take on the British lawyers. Why? Because the crown had started with its first law, the writs of assistance, which said any ship could be searched without a warrant. That violated the Magna Carta. That violated the written law. Our Otis defended us. He was a flame of fire. Quoting sources from the classical Roman Empire to the present day. Quoting the Bible. Never forget the peak of his message when he said, "Is government founded on the crown?" No. As he looked right at the royal authorities. Is government crowned on compact with the crown? No. Is government founded on property rights alone? No. Then what foundation does law and government have? Raising his arm high to the sky, he said, it has only one foundation, and it's in the unchanging, absolute sovereignty of Almighty God. We thought he would win the case for sure. His opponent was his teacher, Jeremiah Gridley, who when it was over and when he finished his 4-hour oration before the royal authorities, Jeremiah Gridley turned to the others and said, "I do hereby say today that my student has risen and slain me in public." But the royal authorities trumped the case and ruled against us. We knew there was trouble when the Stamp Act came in 1764 and the Townshends Acts in 1768. And more acts began to come by Parliament enforcing an internal revenue unjustly against the Constitution. Something had to be done. I was married in 1764, just prior to that Stamp Act, and my dear wife Elizabeth for 8 years bore us 4 children. She died in 1772. It's a date I remember because that was another year that brought more sorrow. For the Boston Massacre had occurred in March of 1770, when British troops had fired into, yes, an angry mob, but at the same time, blood had been shed. Soldiers should not be here in peacetime. We wrote and we appealed. We wrote to England, and we realized from everything that we had been taught, the next step, the next constitutional step had to be boycott. You had to boycott. Why, you could not resist with arms. It was nowhere near that point. And this is where what people know as the Boston Tea Party came in. For in 1772, Samuel Adams started what is known as the Committees of Correspondence. He wrote a letter and he declared the rights that we all had as Christians, as men, and as subjects. He clearly articulated the ideas I've already shared. And he said, let's send them to every colony, every hamlet, and every town, and may the fire of liberty, like a torch, light and ablaze this entire continent. And indeed it did. Town after town wrote their sense of the same principles. We found we were more united than we ever dreamed. And we knew why. Because every preacher preached from the same book in all the colonies. And that's where we got the ideas. We began to meet, and we formed the Committee of Safety. It was 1772. I had just lost my wife of 8 years. I had 4 children, but I knew my time had come. I was not raised for nothing with these principles. I stood, I volunteered, and I became the head of the Committee of Safety. I had to watch the British every action and every motive. We had to know what it was to do. Finally, every tax on every commodity was repealed except tea. And it was interesting, because at first, people threw their hats in the air. They sounded the gongs and the bells in every town. They repealed the tax on painters' colors, repealed the tax on paper, repealed the tax on every area except tea. But they lowered the tax on tea to such a small amount, 3 pence on a pound of tea, of which people don't drink more than 30 pounds or 10 pounds in a year. We saw that's the smallest tax we've ever seen on a commodity, unconstitutional as it was, 30 cents in a year. And we recognized, in fact, we didn't at first, we thought, 30 cents, that's such a small amount. Why, that made it cheaper to buy tea from England than smuggle it in from Holland. And Sam Adams rose at every public meeting he could in Boston and reminded everyone there was a reason for that. Because in fine print at the bottom of the bill, it said, England maintains the principle that it has the right to internally tax the colony in any case whatsoever. In fact, we heard that in England they said, Boston loves tea so much, it will not do without its tea. And we will make them swallow their principle with their tea. But we had leaders that pointed out the principles. And we began to recognize. Letters wrote back and forth because we knew tea ships had been sent to 4 ports. Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And we knew our ships would arrive first. We were the closest. What were we going to do? We were taught the only appeal process left to us was the custom appeal process of British common law. And it was very simple. When a cargo ship came with a commodity you thought had an unjust tax, you had to leave it in port for 20 days. You had to give the owner the opportunity to leave with his cargo. Second, you could not harm the ship, any private property, or the owner himself. Third, you had to make a public demonstration against the tax. And fourth, after 20 days, it was liable for seizure. But nobody could take 1 ounce of tea without paying a tax. Because the principle was clear. You had to make sure You didn't pay anything, not one dime of the tax. And if you were going to stand on that principle, you could not take the commodity. So we were prepared. So when the Dartmouth, the first boatload of tea, arrived in Boston, it was put on a 24-hour guard. 25 men, armed at all times, guarded both the owner and his ship. Immediately, Samuel Adams marked the hour on which the first ship arrived, 3 p.m., November 28. He then counted on the calendar 20 days for the lawful appeal, December 16, 3 p.m. And he called a meeting in all the flyers at Old Faneuil Hall, 3 p.m., December 16. And in the meantime, we did what every colony had done. Why, New York voted unanimously in their legislative assembly not to land any tea. The British owner, when he came into port, knew it, turned around, and went away. In Charlestown, the consignees, those are the ones who had to collect the tax, the import tax, all resigned on the spot and said they were more patriotic to principle than they were for their salaries from England, and a huge applause came from the entire assembly. The consignees had resigned. Philadelphia voted never to land the tea, and the ships left. But in Boston, Governor Hutchinson said, I will not allow the owner to leave, and the consignees wouldn't resign. And now the pressure came. What are we going to do? The days went by like years. We continually appealed to the owner, and he said, I can't leave without the permission of the governor, but I will do whatever I can. The consignees refused to resign. They loved their salary more than the principal. Day after day it went, until all of us knew December 16 would arrive. What would happen? The British had already put up signs around town that said this: on December 17th, we will forcibly land the tea, and you will have to pay the tax, because once that tea goes on the land, you have to pay for it. And we'll do it under the force of arms. They knew the law too. 7,000 people came to the meeting on December 16th. They couldn't fit in Faneuil Hall, so we moved it to the Old South Church. And in the Old South Church, Sam Adams and John Hancock sat up front. And they asked one last time to the owner of the ship, Mr. Roch, what say ye? Mr. Roch turned. I have no pass from the governor's castle. I cannot leave. The moment he said that, there was a rustling. Some of the farmers whose arms are like pipes were getting restless. Someone said in a ruffled voice, tar and feather him! That is the owner. Mr. Adams immediately raised his hand. There shall be no such conduct, he said. We're governed by law here. Mr. Roch is a good man. He's done everything that he knows to do to try to get permission to leave. He shall not be harmed, and neither shall his property be harmed. And it quieted down. We wouldn't know for years how important it was to have leaders more committed to principle than passion. And then Mr. Adams said, this meeting can do nothing more to save this country. The moment he did, we heard a war whoop. Now, I must tell you, the war whoop was mine. Yes, I was one of the ones leading this little party. I might want to tell you too, though it's not truly written in all the history books, a good friend of mine was right next to me, Paul Revere. We had 2 war whoops because half of us were disguised as Mohawk Indians. It was a public display. We were having a little bit of fun, but also we knew that any recognition of our face that was not smeared with the coal that we put on it would be a booty in England. And we figured we'd have some way of living just a little longer. And down to the wharf we went. 3 ships were now in port. The Eleanor and the Beaver had joined the Dartmouth and those 3 ships, and we unloaded all 342 chests of tea, 9,000 pounds altogether, and dumped it into the harbor. There was not a sound. Some raised their hats, but never said a word. You could hear the breaking of the tea chests all the way across the harbor. There was no tumult. In fact, Governor Hutchinson, who watched the whole thing, wrote a history of the Boston Tea Party, and in it he said, I must admit, there was very little tumult. And after all the tea had been dumped, only one or two of the Mohawks tried to take some of the tea bags home. But the leaders said, this will be completely lawful. And they had to put it away. Why, tea bags washed up on shores for days as a testament to the giant teapot in Boston. We had acted constitutionally. We had done our duty. But England came upon us with the Boston Port Bill besieging our town. We were helped by area towns and all across the colonies. A day of fasting and prayer was called June 1st, 1774, the day the Boston Port Bill went into effect. Every church was full and people knelt in prayer outside the churches because they couldn't fit in on the dusty roads. We cried out unto the God that gave us the rights to help protect us. And that 1774 was a mark, a key mark that year for those committees of correspondence, became the seed, the germ of the lower magistrate Continental Congress that would resist lawfully the unconstitutional acts of the British Empire. I must tell you that it was June of 1775 where I died in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it was the British general that said my death was worth 500 of his own British soldiers. Because he said my influence, my writings, and my resolve would defeat the British Empire faster than our arms. They knew right makes might. Okay, that is the story of the Boston Tea Party. Now what I want to do, come out of character here for a minute, and review some of these points. And here's what I would like you to do while we do this. I'm going to move pretty quickly through these slides, and I'm going to review some of the points I just taught. And here's what I would like you to do tonight. I would like you, as you listen, jot down anything that you think in any way is significant to any crisis our nation faces today. For I believe that the idea of tea parties taking place are not insignificant. But I also believe that if we're not careful, if we don't follow the principles that founded our nation, and we don't follow the proper constitutional principles, we could see a spirit of anarchy rise in the land. That's the last thing we want. So what I would like to do is very quickly walk through this with you, and then I want to show you just a few things, how these principles that I just taught to you and just talked to you about are embedded even in the granite in the city of Boston, even in the State House of the city of Boston. Almost everything I told you is either in picture form, mural form, engraving on stones, all throughout the city of Boston. So that I think it would have warranted a 1-hour special television program on tea parties where it all began, filming every location and every mural. But since that didn't happen, I'll show you them now. So what was this Boston Tea Party? Well, you've heard me already say it. It was not a riot or a lawless rebellion. There was little noise or tumult. It was not even a protest on too much tax. They did not protest 3 cents on a pound of tea. They were not protesting too much tax. Then what was it? We'd have to say, from a constitutional standpoint, it was a lawful boycott of a commodity unjustly taxed without constitutional authority, forced upon a colony by a national centralized government. Interesting. Now, I've often taught it on the streets to tourists this way. Ideas meet for action. What does this mean? Anytime a group of people meet, the only purpose for a meeting is to discuss key ideas, whether they're from a sermon, whether they're from the law. Biblical ideas are supreme. But what do you mean? Ideas articulate principles, and are they cause? Ideas give vision for the long term. Meetings allow ideas expression. Meetings refine communication. But the purpose of a meeting is lead to action. Action is united as an effect. Action can restore lawful liberty. So we might want to say this. If someone were to ask you, what was the Boston Tea Party? I remember having a little bit of a discussion with someone from the media this last Wednesday on Boston Common, dressed like this, and I asked them the question. They said this to me, well, isn't it true that the Boston Tea Party is the riot they precipitated the revolution? I said, no. The Boston Tea Party was the action that culminated from principle. It was the effect, not the cause. It was an event that was a lawful boycott because of ideas already embraced. Here's the danger. The danger is if we act and try to precipitate things through action alone without laying the proper principles and the proper methods and having them discussed and refined. Remember, when Joseph Warren was a part of this event, there had been a legacy in his own lifetime. He was 34 years of age when he died at Bunker Hill. And do you know that he had lived long enough to have heard about 25 years worth of sermons? It's estimated today, if you went to church Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, the weekly Thursday lecture, went to the military and the election sermons, and you did it from the age of 5 to 18, just by sitting in church and taking notes, you would have the equivalent of 3 college educations. That's how articulate the sermons were. They were 25 pages printed in the newspaper and 2 hours long on a Sunday. And the idea was the actions were the effect, not the cause. Also, that first idea, rights are God-given. Notice what Sam Adams said in his first Committees of Correspondence letter. He said, the right to freedom being the gift of God Almighty, it is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. He said, you are in sin if you voluntarily give up your rights from God, because when God gives something to you by common law, you cannot give away what God gave you to steward. That's why in constitutional law we call it this way. If the legislative body has been given the right to pass laws, the legislative body cannot pass that responsibility on to anybody else, because they are the ones to steward it. You can't shirk your responsibility. Also, it's very clear here that rights are God-given. Well, how do you see this in Boston? Well, of course you see it in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by who? Our Creator with certain unalienable rights. That means cannot be alienated from you. If God gives them, they cannot be taken away. If government gives them, what? Government can take them away. Also, in Boston, right there at the State House, at the very first time the State House was dedicated, the cornerstone on July 4, 1795, the governor happened to be Samuel Adams. He said, may the principles of our excellent Constitution, founded in nature and in the rights of man, be ably defended here, and may the same principles be deeply engraven in the hearts of all citizens. Now, 2 phrases you need to understand. Natural rights, and in the rights of man. You see, the rights of man was a synonym to God-given rights. And it's actually the same phrase as the laws of nature and of nature's God. The laws of nature, different from natural law, and the laws of God. The laws of nature are the laws God has written into all of creation, and the laws of God He wrote in the Bible. And those were common phrases. They don't mean their rights come from nature. The phrase is very clear. They're natural rights. In fact, this is so engraven in our own Commonwealth that there's a little model of the State House right about here in this little room. If I were to do it up here, if you can see it, right in there, in that room, there's a little model of the State House. And next to that model, there is a sculpture that was dedicated and given to the state of Massachusetts in 1976 to honor the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence. And the woman, Kay Worden, who crafted that, named it Creation. You know why she named it Creation? Because the rights you have come from your Creator. And this is what it looks like. That little thing is 2 hands coming out of the air and forming man from the dust of the earth. It's an actual sculpture of Genesis 2:7. God forming man from the dust of the earth. And that stands right in the State House. In other words, All around the legislature is the symbol of rights coming from God. Natural rights directly from creation. Now, it also says that second idea, government is by covenant. Every natural right not expressly given up or from the nature of a social compact necessarily ceded remains. Now, what does this mean? Why does Sam Adams say this? Think with me for a moment. It simply means the following. That what only power government has is what's written in the Constitution that's expressly given to it. The civil government has no power except what the people give, because God gives the power to the people, and the people give limited power to the government. And what powers have we given? Only what is expressed. Anything not expressed has not been ceded, has not been given. So therefore, everything the Constitution leaves out is to your benefit. Today we think, oh, how come the founders left this out? They didn't. How come religion isn't written all the way into the Constitution? Because civil government had no power over it. You see, so it's an express powers document. That's how we understand that. It was by covenant. And the colonists understood it. Well, this is right on the cornerstone of the Boston Common. This huge marker is called the Covenant of Boston, put there in 1930. In fact, on the opposite side, it's the arrival of John Winthrop in 1630 that's commemorated when he came to John Endicott, governor of Salem. And on the back side are several engravings. One is this from John Winthrop, and it's the engraving, "We must consider that we shall be a city set upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and to cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." Written right on this huge stone marker is the fact that if you don't follow God's covenant, you will be cursed for it. I'll paraphrase right out of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is what John Winthrop was writing about in his model of Christian charity, from which this paragraph was taken. Just to make sure, they also put the most famous quote of William Bradford right under this, the next paragraph. "Thus out of small beginnings greater things have been produced by his hand that made all things of nothing, gives being to all things that are. And as one small candle shall light 1,000, so the light here kindled has shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation, let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise." And that was written by William Bradford about the year 1630 because of the impact the Pilgrims had upon the Puritans. And then it says this, "In gratitude to God for the blessings enjoyed under a free government, the city of Boston erected this memorial on the 300th anniversary of its founding, Mayor James Curley, 1630 to 1930. Amazing. Here's the marker that government operates by covenant. We also see in the back, the very first marker ever given to the War of Independence was in Boston. It was on top of Beacon Hill, where there used to be a beacon to warn people and to direct people. This was called the first independence marker, a large eagle on the top of this marker. If you look right up here, and steps going up Beacon Hill. This was before the State House had been completed. You can see the dome of the State House. The highest thing in Boston was the eagle. And not only that, you see this picture here, you see it here, when the State House is completed, they're cutting out the Beacon Hill in order to, and this eagle is on the top. And then they started to say, where are we going to do this? Because the eagle was formed, that eagle was crafted by Charles Bulfinch, and it was the exact model of the national seal. His best friend was Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Continental Congress. Charles Thompson was a member of the American Bible Society. He actually translated the scriptures from the original language, was a biblical scholar, and Charles Thompson, as the secretary, he's the one that proposed the eagle to be the national symbol. Franklin wanted a turkey. Thomas Jefferson wanted the Red Sea parted with the Israelites going through. John Adams wanted the Saxons because they were the first ones who inherited the law of God from the Galatian believers. And so on and on it would go. And Charles Thompson won with the eagle, and this is what he meant. When he did that, the first place that it was prominently placed in 3 dimensions was in Boston. Why? Because now it's in the back of the State House. And Charles Thompson said, I want it on the wing and rising. Not only that, it's the incarnation of the principle of the deity. Charles Thompson said the eagle has his wings outstretched from the prayers of God's people, taking them to God and interposing in the affairs of men. This was because that was the covenant that God had used. And that's why that very eagle is now at the highest point of the State House in the dome. Within its beak, God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So you see engraven on every area, and this is not alone in Boston. I bet I could go to state capitals across the United States, I have, and see the same things engraven, that we had a covenant with God. And that covenant was written in a charter. Well, the third then idea, the lawful appeal to injustice. Adam said the colonists have been branded with the odious names of traitors and rebels only for complaining of their grievances. In other words, all we did was follow the constitutional means for redressing our grievances, and you call us traitors. You call us rebels. We're not rebels. We're following the very written law that you wrote for us. And yet when we follow it, you call us rebels. Well, steps of lawful resistance that they were understood were the following. I'll just go quickly. The Bible, they were taught in the colonies that the Bible told you to take personal insults. When Jesus said you're slapped on one face and you turn the cheek, that has nothing to do with self-defense. That has to do with a personal insult. If you're insulted by someone in the street, that doesn't mean that's it, I'm going to war. Not so. You are to appeal for a resolution, Matthew 18. The appeals process. You can boycott. Do you know when Jesus said this? If you go into a city and the city does not receive you, come out to the gates and shake the dust of feet. You know what that meant. That was a form of boycott. That simply meant when you shook the dust off your feet, you simply said, I'm not going to trade in the gates of the city any longer because it's a form of resistance to your inhospitality. Therefore, I am not going to resist. Boycott is a legitimate biblical appeal process, as was the Boston Tea Party. Civil interposition by lower magistrates. Resistance is always under authority. Paul the Apostle did that by appealing to the Romans when his rights were violated. Matthew 10:23, you can flee. That's a biblical thing. Flee to avoid greater conflict. Or Acts 5:29, you can disobey by obeying God when you're commanded to disobey God's words. That could result in martyrdom. And the last is forceful resistance, where Jesus says in Luke 22, he tells them in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. But the same Jesus who said that when it was not time for darkness to reign, afterwards when he gave instructions to the disciples, he said, there's coming a day when the Romans will invade Jerusalem. You better buy a sword, and you better have one and know how to use it to defend your family and your children. Go buy a sword, he said. So Jesus endorsed the fact that there may come a time for forceful resistance. Calvin's lower magistrate principle was clear. Calvin said that a lower magistrate, a civil magistrate, had to resist encroachments of the higher magistrate in order to be properly defending the law. And I won't read the quote, but also the fact of the matter is we know here also that recognition, vinde contra tyrannus in 1579, tells us again, when we speak of all the people, we understand only those who hold their authority from the people. In other words, the only form of people that can resist authority and interpose are those that hold authority from the people. Legitimately, people cannot rebel directly against authority. It has to be with the proper means. This happened in Massachusetts. There's a mural in the State House that says the following again. And Governor Andros was sent by England. He claimed all the land owned by England, and he asked this, all right, we're going to have an Anglican church here. They were not Anglicans. And everyone's going to come to my service. Who will donate the land for the Anglican church? Guess how many people in Boston donated land? 0. So what he did to make him mad is he built a church on top of the bones of the original Puritans who came to Boston. Desecrating their graves, he built, that would really help out his public relations. And he did that, and they still wouldn't go to his service. Then he locked them out of the Old South Church, threatening the deacon if they didn't give him the keys. And the Puritans said, we don't need a building to worship. We can worship under a tree. The center of your service is the service, and ceremony, the center of ours is the word. We can preach on the waterfront. Finally, they'd had enough of Governor Andros, and when William and Mary came to the throne in the bloodless revolution, and they saw it, they interposed, which meant the lower magistrate went, arrested the governor for violating the covenant in the written constitution, put him on a ship, and sailed him back to England. And that mural faces the legislative body of the state of Massachusetts. Interposition. Also, here's James Otis in that famous mural when he's doing that oration I talked to you about, the writs of assistance. And guess who's in the audience? John Adams, at 27 years of age, is in the audience. And when Otis finishes his oration, John Adams writes in his diary, this day, 1761, the child independence is born. That became a famous phrase. Because on this day, the independence of the child of America. Also, in the mural is Sam Adams, the power of our pen. Notice what Sam Adams would say. If our trade is taxed, why not our lands? I mean, you have to understand, in colonial America, that was considered the height of tyranny for the government to tax the land. Because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and you cannot tax the land. You can't tax the source of income. And therefore, he said, look, if our trade, that is our labor, is taxed. And in history, it is simply known that if you tax labor, it's socialism. If you tax land, it's communism. The idea is, why not the produce of our lands then? Everything we possess. He says, if we don't resist in the first infraction, they're going to tax everything. That's a shock. John Hancock, who was the wealthiest man in Boston, said, despise the glare of wealth. They plainly show that wealth, however it may be acquired, is in their esteem to be preferred to virtue. In other words, the British Empire tried to buy their way through everything. They offered money to Sam Adams. Sam Adams was always poor. His best friend was John Hancock. Took 4 people to carry his chest of clothes. Changed his clothes 3 times a day. Richest man in Boston at 27 years of age. Sam Adams, probably the poorest man in Boston. They said as many times his children were without shoes, because Adams gave away all his money to the cause. And when they walked down the street together, Sam Adams would have a tiny little knapsack that would last him a month. Hancock would have 4 people carrying his trunk. They were kind of funny. But it was clear that they tried to buy off Sam Adams, and they tried to give him all the money he could possibly have, and he wouldn't take it. They tried to buy off Hancock, too, and he said, he said, who do you think I am? And he compared the British trying to betray Jesus. And Paul Revere, the power of courageous. He was the messenger of the revolution. Went where no one was willing to go. They would ask him, his wife, where's your husband? She said, probably in danger, but he'll be home tonight. One day, just one quick story, on Christmas Day, Paul Revere was snooping on the British to make sure he knew where they were, and they captured him, and they put him on Castle Island in a jail cell with bars. It was Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and he didn't get home till almost midnight Christmas Day. Of course, he got away and got out, and when he came home, he apologized to his wife for missing Christmas, but it was a lot of fun spying on the British. That's the kind of guy he was. A bit eccentric, but they recognized this. If you ever wanted to marry one of Paul Revere's daughters, you would have to go face him to start the courtship. And it said in Boston, the lingo was, it scared away most guys because they would not face Revere. And so that fearless courage was something critical. And why, in that very mural of that room in the State House, all of those things, the power of the pen, the power of the spoken word, the power of wealth, all culminated with one event. What's the event? The Boston Tea Party, as lawful resistance to tyranny. So in conclusion, we have to recognize this. When the time came, all eyes were on Boston. Philadelphia wrote him a letter, said, all we fear is you will shrink at Boston. May God give you the virtue enough to save the liberties of your country. Don't shrink in Boston. The ships are going to come to you. You're the only port where the consignees didn't resign. You're the only port where the governor wouldn't let the ship leave. And so obviously when they came there, a lawful British boycott, we've already seen it. They had to leave the cargo in port 20 days. It arrived November 28. They had to protect the owner and his property. They had to make a public demonstration. And the cargo was liable for seizure after 20 days. They destroyed 342 chests of tea, 9,000 pounds after 3 p.m., one day before the British were going to forcibly land it. The British soldiers were absolutely shocked. They never thought they would stand on principle. And they were totally thwarted because they acted constitutionally. So what happened? John Adams, this is his diary. Listen to this. Last night, 3 cargoes of Bohea tea were emptied into the sea. This morning, a man of war sails. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid and inflexible. It must have important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history. Many persons wish that as many dead carcasses were floating in the harbor as there were chests of tea, meaning the British were wishing that they could kill the people. What measure will the ministry take? Will they punish us? How? quartering troops among us, annulling our charter, by laying on more duties, by restraining our trade, by sacrifice of individuals, or how? This is the night of the Tea Party, he writes in his diary. What's going to happen as a result of this? We have acted our duty. In fact, Sam Adams said it was the highest joy that sparks in the eyes, animates the countenances, as well as the hearts. Governor Hutchinson said the whole was done with very little tumult. He was not their friend, he was their enemy. John Scoley, the selectman of Boston, said, we console ourselves that we have acted how? Constitutionally. Catherine Drinker Bowen, one of the greatest historians of the American Revolution, put it this: not a life was lost, not a man was hurt, no drop of blood was shed. In the moonlight, a vast crowd assembled on the dock watched almost in silence while the Mohawks did their work. The stillness was extraordinary. The crash of hatchets could plainly be heard across the line of water, and occasional perspiring grunts as men tipped the heavy boxes over the bulwarks. None of the Mohawks kept so much as a fistful of tea to himself. One or two who tried it were quickly and summarily dissuaded. When morning came, tea marked the edge of high tide on beaches as far south as Nantasket. And the consequences were simple. Paul Revere took the news. He was the messenger. He went down to New York to let them know, and on to Philadelphia, that they did not shrink at Boston. Not only that, Ben Franklin offered to pay as reconciliation for all the tea, but not the tax. He offered the British out of his own pocket to pay for all the tea. All right, you really upset? Okay. I'll pay for the tea, but not the tax. They turned him down. Boston Port Bill is enacted June 1, 1774. The colonies call for fasting and prayer. Aid comes from the other colonies, and also the Suffolk Resolves are drawn up by Joseph Warren. Those Suffolk Resolves are stating the rights of the colonists, and the committees of correspondence become the Continental Congress. And the Boston Tea Party, it is said, culminates in the first act of interposition when the Continental Congress is started. What's the first thing that they do? September 7, 1774. They appeal to the God who rules the nations. And they bow in prayer after Jacob Touché has read from Psalm 35. And they pray to Almighty God. This nation was birthed in prayer, but it was also birthed in lawful action against unjust government. Not lawless rebellion against lawful authority. Amen? Hopefully and prayerfully, a history lesson can help you to begin to put things in perspective. What I'd like to do right now, and I'll do this just for a few minutes, and then we will have a time of, we can have some time of questions. I do want to just let you know that there are several tape sets and CDs at the book table that we'll go into this in a bit more detail. I'll be a lot more detailed tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning we are going to walk through the major premises of what Americans knew at the time of the Revolution, American Christians, and what we need to know again today, and also what we can do today and what we should be doing in order to restore the lost understanding of these principles. But first, I want to cash in on that little promise I gave you. What do you see in this lesson that Americans need to know today? Yes? Okay, so she said the legislature makes the laws. People ought to know. You can see this from here, not judges. This is true. And this also came up. Someone else. What do you see from this event? Do you think Americans know the true history of the Boston Tea Party? I give the story on the streets of Boston whenever I can, and I have shocked looks. I had a man come up to me just this Wednesday when I told the story of the Tea Party at the Tea Party in Boston. And he said the following to me. He said, I never knew. I just thought their tempers ran over on December 16th. I didn't know they waited till December 16th in order to be within lawful appeal. Is that an important fact? Very important. Someone else. What can you see that's a parallel or something Americans need to know today from this? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so she says that one thing we ought to know is the land belongs to God and it's unlawful to tax it. Yeah. Because that's been going on for so long, we've taken it simply at face value. If you want to do a little research project, you can look at this. Thomas Jefferson wrote, and he said, all the land in America is allodial. If you look up the word allodial in Webster's 1828 dictionary, A-L-L-O-D-I-A-L, it will be God-given land that is totally owned by you, that no government can tax and can never be diminished as you pass it from one generation to the next. And it will say the opposite of allodial land is feudal land. Feudalism is when the king owns the land. The government owns the land, and the proof that the government owns the land is that you pay rent in order to use it. And the rent is simply called taxation. And the ideas are here. And don't think that you can just walk in someplace and start telling people that you have allodial land. It's like trying to go to the bank and get your gold. It's been long lost, but that's true. That's an idea that was well known at the time of the founding. Somebody else? Yes, sir. Americans need to know much more about their history, as indicated in this. This is just one event. But do you also realize that I could tell the same similar story about other events because other events have the same foundation? But good point. Yes, sir. Okay, so the gentleman is saying that today, one of the problems we have is that history books are written as revisionist books that are not telling the truth. Now, we have gone through 2 or 3 phases. Initially, it was history books that left out key events and facts. Now they're revising the stories themselves and are no longer accurate, as you were saying. And they're writing that for children, which means we have to restore education. You have the stewardship as parents to make sure your children learn what is true. And someone came up to me and said, well, how is that possible? I don't have time after school. I said, that's the point. And you need to recapture that. Yes, sir. So the question is, do you think that all the revisionist is purposeful? No. A lot of it is ignorant. But there are those, as the gentleman was bringing out, that are purposefully doing that. So it would be a both and to that. You had something you wanted to add to that? Okay. So the idea is it's a lot of it is ignorance. And I'd have to say this too. Most of what Americans don't know about the crisis we're in right now and how we even got here. People think that the problem just started with bailouts. I mean, the reason they could get away, or at least seemingly get away, the Americans are rising up, but seemingly getting away with bailouts is because of our ignorance. We have been operating on an unconstitutional monetary system since 1913 in the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is not federal because it's not run by Congress, it doesn't reserve anything, and it's not a bank. And so I use those 3 points in order to teach on the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve removed the economy from the Congress control that Article 1, Section 8 says it's supposed to be in, and gave it to private bankers who lend back bonds to America with interest. So the idea is that we are so far from this, and a lot of it is ignorance, and some of it is willful. But the most important thing for Americans is not our duty as Christians to figure out which conspiracy is coming down the pike. We don't own a conspiracy view of history. We own a providential view of history. Conspiracies are not in charge of history. God is in charge of history. Isn't that good news? And therefore, there's always going to be a conspiracy as long as there is a Lucifer and as long as there is a demonic kingdom. But there's also always going to be a winner called the people of God as long as there is a God who is sovereign. And guess what? He's going to outlast the demonic kingdom by a long shot. Somebody else? Comment or a question? Yes, sir. Right. Okay, so the thought is that we have to resist whenever there is tyranny or unjust government. We have to resist under authority. We cannot take the law into our own hands. We cannot do it any way we wish. I teach young people a lot, and I try to tell them right away that to resist your parents' authority is rebellion. You can't do that. When you think something is unjust, you are to build a relationship. You can appeal to your parents, but lawful appeal with the right attitude gets an audience with your parents very different than direct rebellion. And most of their eyes light up. Is this true? And you need to submit to authority. And remember, this is true in every area of life, that God never condones direct rebellion. Okay, somebody else. Yes, sir. I think most of you heard that. I won't try to summarize it all, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the issues you raise, we will deal with in principle form tomorrow, and we're going to lay a foundation very slowly, but lay a foundation, I think, systematically, that you'll be able to see there's something you can do. I want to show you that there are materials you can get right now, starting with your family or with a small group. It could be used in a Sunday school of a church or anywhere else, and begin to simply teach, once again, these principles, because it's critical. I'll just share one story that relates to what this gentleman said. I was debating, it was a friendly type debate on a Christian radio program. My opponent said America never had a Christian history. I was defending the point that she had a Christian history. And I'll never forget when my opponent began, he said, well, I think I'm going to win this argument in 5 minutes. Now, that's not a good thing to say to me, okay? I was like flexing a little bit. That's pretty audacious. I haven't even opened my mouth yet. But anyway, he said this. He said, I guarantee Dr. Jehle will have no answer to this. And he said, here's the point. He said, how could America have a Christian history when the very people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, at least a percentage of them, owned slaves? How could that possibly be that America could be in such sin and yet supposedly confess Christ as Lord of the law? So my response was to him, I said, let me ask you a question. Are you a Christian? Now, of course, he had already said he was, but are you a Christian? He said, yes. I said, is there any sin in your life? It was as quiet as it is right now. And I said, well then, if your answer is yes by your silence, I don't believe you're a Christian. How could you be a Christian and there be sin in your life? The question is not whether there was sin in America. The only reason we know there was sin is because of the contrast to the profession of those who were confessing that Christ was their Lord. And the more Christianity grew, the more incompatible it was obviously with slavery. And I asked him another question. I said, who led the anti-slavery movement? The Christian or the non-Christian? It was the Christian. And so you need to be careful, because I said, then if this is the case, if we're going to have a standard for America's past, then let's hold the same standard to today. But it's not a biblical standard, because you can profess something, and actually the historians said the Declaration of Independence was the anchor that we could pull ourselves up to, because the profession was higher than our practice. And that's not something to say we weren't a Christian nation. You don't have an anchor to pull yourself up to if there's nothing there. Does that make sense? So don't flinch from that. Were there sins in America? No question about it. And don't forget the mistreatment of the Indians, starting with the Andrew Jackson administration. And there are other things that we could go on. Yes, there were sins. And we should be ashamed of any of those sins that have happened. But don't, at the same time, think that because there was something wrong with America. There are no perfect nations. And so anyway, good. Well, we're running out of time here, but maybe one last question. Does someone have a question there? Go ahead. I think that's good, and just be careful also that when you do a documentary, just because it's called a documentary does not mean it's true. And so you do need to make sure you are able to convey and go back to the truth. Because whether they're picking on Thomas Jefferson one year or George Washington the next, you do need to know what those men actually did do. And the very people they pick on were the ones who led the abolition of slavery themselves, freed their own slaves. Washington freed his own slaves. Washington never treated them as part of his own family. And many people did the same. So you do need to know the facts, but that's one thing on one level. But the most important thing I can leave with you tonight, you wouldn't have a history like this, where the Boston Tea Party actually carries through to them starting the Continental Congress on their knees in prayer, appealing to the God of nations. You wouldn't have this unless the average believer in the colonies had embraced ideas that had been preached from the Word of God, that they had heard consistently. And the greatest challenge we have today is not just knowing the facts of our history. Yes, that's important. But you won't make any sense out of the facts unless you know where they came from. Why did they do what they did? And I think you might agree with me today, there's a lot of things that are different about that day and now. And one of the greatest challenges we have today is we do not have the 90 to 95% consensus attested by them of everybody being taught the same things and on the same page philosophically. And as they said, of the handful of unconverted people in the colonies, because of the great awakening that had come, that handful of unconverted people, often many of them went along. And even when you came to the resistance, only a third of the colony was willing to stand for resistance. 1/3 supposedly remained neutral, and the other third were called Tories. Because even though they had the same theology, when it came down to risking your life, some were willing to just go to England and when it's over, come back. And the idea was that we are faced with a challenge today. And it's not just a challenge of saying we've had enough. It's a challenge of saying, where do we go to redig the wells from which the ideas flow? And that's going to come from the Word. And that's what we're going to do tomorrow morning, because we want to come back tomorrow morning in order to work, in order to have fun, but in order to articulate these ideas in a way that you can take them with you with some materials and begin training with your own family. Amen? Amen. God bless you.